In a mansion frozen by grief, where laughter hasn't echoed in years, two little boys live trapped in silence, Noah and Ethan, twins born deaf, whose mother died the day they came into the world. Their father, William Carter, a billionaire shattered by loss, believes nothing can reach them until a new housekeeper arrives. Aaliyah Johnson, a warm-hearted woman with no titles or fame, steps into their lives, and something changes. One song, one dance, one moment in the kitchen will break through years of sorrow and silence. But what if that moment is only the beginning? Stay with us to discover how healing can come from the most unexpected places. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us, can love really bring a family back to life? Aaliyah had been in the Carter mansion for just over 2 weeks, long enough to understand the rhythm of silence that seemed to govern the household. The children rarely came near her, choosing instead to sit quietly in their chairs or wander the hallways with their eyes lowered, lost in a world no one seemed able to enter. William himself was more of a presence than a participant in the life of his children, moving like a shadow between his office and the upstairs rooms, speaking only when necessary, his words precise and brief. That morning had been no different, and Aaliyah had felt a certain frustration building in her chest as she prepared lunch. She had grown up in a noisy household where laughter and music filled every corner, where even disagreements had been loud, colorful, and human. The Carter mansion, by contrast, felt hollow. On impulse, as she stood in the kitchen and watched the twins sit at the small table without expression, she reached into her bag and pulled out the little speaker she always carried. Without overthinking it, she pressed play, letting a song by Aretha Franklin burst softly into the room. The melody was warm, alive, full of soul. She expected nothing, maybe even resistance, but instead, something shifted. Noah looked up first, his brows furrowing, his lips moving as though forming a question. Ethan, sitting beside him, blinked rapidly, then began tapping his heel against the chair leg. The sound seemed to thread itself into them, and Aaliyah's heart jumped when a giggle, small and fragile, escaped one of the boys. Her instincts told her not to stop. She put the speaker on the counter and began to sway her hips in time with the rhythm, exaggerating her movements just enough to be playful. "Come on, little men," she said, her voice bright and teasing, though she knew they could not hear her words in the way she intended. She moved closer to them, exaggerating the beat with her arms, spinning once in a circle. Noah tilted his head, then mimicked the smallest part of her movement by rocking his torso forward and back. Ethan slapped his tiny hands on the tabletop, then slid off his chair clumsily and stood, his knees wobbling, eyes wide with something close to joy. Aaliyah gasped, but covered it with a laugh, clapping her hands once to encourage him. "That's it, sweetheart. Yes, just like that." She twirled again, letting her braids follow the motion, and when she glanced back, she caught Noah sliding down from his seat too, determined not to be left behind. Their movements were awkward, unsteady, and so far from graceful, but it didn't matter because they were moving. They were reacting. They were alive in a way she hadn't seen before. She knelt slightly, dancing on their level now, encouraging their steps. Noah's giggles grew louder, bouncing off his brother's shy but eager attempts to copy. Ethan stomped his little feet, and his laughter, thin, high-pitched but real, sent a sharp ache through Aaliyah's chest. She found herself smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. The more she moved, the more they responded. Aaliyah decided to test the bond forming in those few moments. She bent low, picked up Ethan's small hands, and guided them side to side like a dance partner. He resisted for a second, then relaxed, looking up at her with wide eyes that almost glowed with pride. Noah tugged at her skirt, impatient not to be left out, so she freed one hand and took his as well, swaying with both boys as though they were a trio on a stage only they could see. "See? We're dancing. You feel it, don't you?" she whispered, though she knew words were not what carried the meaning. Her expression and touch did. The boys laughed again, clear, unguarded, contagious. Noah tried to spin in a clumsy circle, almost falling, but Aaliyah steadied him, lifting him back upright. "You're all right, baby. Try again." She exaggerated a spin herself, and this time both boys clapped, a sharp, imperfect rhythm that matched the beat faintly spilling from the speaker. For years, they had ignored toys, ignored games, ignored the well-meaning attempts of strangers who tried to break their silence. Yet here, now, they were reacting as if the music had always been inside them, waiting for the right person to unlock it. The kitchen had transformed into something no therapy session had ever achieved. Noah lifted his arms like an airplane, wobbling from side to side, while Ethan attempted to copy Aaliyah's swaying hips, his tiny body jerking out of sync, but full of determination. She laughed with them, not at them, her joy feeding theirs in an endless loop. "That's it, explorers," she whispered, kneeling again, her forehead nearly touching Ethan's as she mirrored his stomp. He giggled, louder this time, a pure sound that rang through her in a way that made her eyes sting. Noah rushed to her other side, clapping in rhythm with the beat, and then all three of them were caught in the loop of motion and laughter. She felt her chest tightening with something she hadn't expected to feel so quickly: attachment. In only 2 weeks, she'd been trying to find the crack in their shell, the one spark that might connect them. And now, here it was. Music. It wasn't about hearing in the traditional sense. It was vibration, rhythm, movement, connection. They could feel it, and so could she. For the first time since she had arrived in the Carter mansion, she believed these boys were not unreachable. They were simply waiting for the right rhythm to guide them out of their shadows. It was in the middle of this impromptu dance that William walked in. He had intended only to grab a file he had left on the counter earlier, his mind still spinning with the details of a business deal, when he stopped dead at the sight before him. The file slipped from his hand without him noticing. Noah and Ethan were not withdrawn, not staring blankly at walls as they usually did. They were moving, laughing. Ethan's head was thrown back in unrestrained joy, his hands still wrapped tightly around Aaliyah's fingers as though afraid to let go. Noah stumbled into her side, clutching her arm for balance, but laughing all the same. The sound, the sight, hit William with such force that his breath caught. His children were laughing. His sons, who had spent 3 years locked in silence, were dancing clumsily in the middle of his kitchen, their tiny feet stomping in time to a song he hadn't heard since his wife was alive. His chest ached with something violent, something long buried. Hope. He wanted to move, to step into the room, to demand how this was happening, but his feet refused. All he could do was stand there, rooted in shock, watching the impossible unfold. He didn't even realize his hand had lifted to his chest until he felt his fingers press against the sharp ache spreading there. The scene before him blurred for a moment, as if his mind couldn't process it. Aaliyah twirled once more, then bent low to look into Ethan's face, her smile radiant, her voice soft, though William could not hear the words over the rush of his own heartbeat. Noah clapped again, signing something rudimentary with his little hands, and Ethan followed suit, their eyes shining with joy. William's throat tightened until it burned. He hadn't seen them like this, hadn't believed they could ever look like this. For the first time in years, there was life in their eyes, unfiltered, raw, and overwhelming, and at the center of it all was Aaliyah, the woman he had barely noticed beyond her duties, now drawing out of his children something that no doctor, no therapist, no specialist had been able to. He felt dizzy with the realization that the silence which had smothered his house had been broken, not by him, but by her. Standing in the doorway, he could do nothing but stare, his chest heavy with shock, grief, and the flicker of a dangerous, long-forgotten hope. The next morning, William woke before dawn, his body restless though he had barely slept. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows braced on his knees, head bowed as though the sheer weight of memory pressed him downward. No matter how hard he tried to focus on the day's obligations, meetings, contracts, negotiations, one image kept intruding, stubborn and unrelenting. Noah and Ethan laughing, their small feet stumbling to a rhythm only they seemed to understand. He had watched them move as if life had suddenly been poured into their veins. That memory should have filled him with gratitude, but instead it left him shaken. For years, he had been told by specialists, therapists, entire teams of experts that the boys' condition would keep them isolated, their connection to the outside world forever fragile and uncertain. And yet, in a matter of minutes, the household maid had cracked open what they could not. It was exhilarating, yes, but also terrifying, because it meant everything he thought he understood about his sons, about his grief, about the silence that had defined their lives, was no longer solid ground. His chest tightened as though resisting the possibility. He paced his room, replaying the scene over and over, searching for something that would allow him to dismiss it as coincidence, but it wouldn't leave him. It had lodged itself inside him, stubborn as a splinter. He found Aliyah in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. Noah and Ethan sat at the small table, their hands busy with toys they usually ignored, but today they tapped the blocks against the wood in something resembling a rhythm. William's throat closed at the sight, but instead of acknowledging it, he latched onto the surge of control that always kept him steady. "Miss Johnson," he said sharply, his voice slicing through the room. She glanced up, her face calm, but her eyes sharpened with awareness. "What exactly do you think you're doing with my children?" His tone carried accusation, as though she had broken an unspoken law. Aliyah set down the knife she'd been holding, wiped her hands deliberately on a cloth, and faced him fully. "I was giving them joy," she replied simply. "They deserve that." William's brows drew together, his jaw tightening. "They don't need tricks. They need structure, therapy, schedules. What you did yesterday, it wasn't treatment. It was reckless." His words landed like a verdict, but Aliyah didn't flinch. She leaned one hand against the counter, steady as stone, and met his glare without hesitation. "With respect, Mr. Carter, joy isn't reckless. It's the only thing they've been starved of." Her words struck like a blow because deep inside, he knew she was right, though he refused to show it. The silence that followed stretched thin, crackling with the tension of unspoken truths. William tried to speak again, to reassert his authority, but the memory of his son's laughing rose unbidden, robbing him of certainty. "You're overstepping," he finally managed, though his voice lacked the steel it usually carried. Aliyah, noticing the hesitation, softened her tone, but not her stance. "I'm not trying to replace the doctors. I'm not even pretending I have their knowledge. But what I can do is see your sons as more than a diagnosis. They are children, Mr. Carter, children who crave connection. Yesterday they let me in. That means something, whether you want to admit it or not." William swallowed hard, his hands clenching at his sides. He was unaccustomed to defiance, especially from someone in her position, yet her words pierced deeper than he cared to admit. He wanted to dismiss her as naive, but the image of Ethan's small hand clutching hers refused to release him. It was a battlefield inside his chest, pride against longing, grief against possibility. He drew in a breath, trying to steady himself, but it came out ragged, betraying the war he couldn't control. Later that morning, William attempted to bury himself in work. He locked himself in his office, papers spread across his desk, numbers and figures demanding attention. Yet every time he picked up his pen, it hovered above the page uselessly, his thoughts dragging him back to the kitchen. He saw Ethan's head tilted back in laughter, Noah's tiny claps, Aliyah's radiant smile as she guided them, his chest constricted with a mix of admiration and resentment. He hated the vulnerability creeping in, hated the thought that someone else could achieve in one moment what he, with all his wealth and resources, had failed to do for years. And beneath that resentment was the raw, terrifying truth. He wanted more. He wanted to see them laugh again, to hear those giggles that had shaken the walls of silence. But allowing that meant opening a door he had kept locked since the day Emily died. It meant risking the possibility of hope, and hope was dangerous, cruel, because if it broke, it would destroy him completely. He rubbed his eyes, frustrated, the pen clattering from his hand as he leaned back in his chair, lost in thoughts he could not silence. When he emerged from his office hours later, the house was quiet, but not in the way it used to be. The silence now carried an undercurrent of expectancy, as though the memory of laughter still lingered. He found himself drawn toward the living room, where Aaliyah sat on the floor with Noah and Ethan beside her. They were stacking blocks, something simple. But what caught William's attention was the way Noah reached out unprompted, tugging gently at Aaliyah's sleeve to draw her gaze. She responded instantly, smiling as she adjusted the tower they were building, guiding his little hand to place the next block. Ethan leaned against her shoulder, watching intently, his small body relaxed in a way William rarely saw. The sight rooted him to the spot. His sons, who often avoided contact, were leaning into her as if she were a fixture of safety. A pang of something sharp and foreign pierced him. Jealousy, perhaps, or shame that it wasn't him they sought out. He turned away quickly, swallowing the lump in his throat, but the image remained etched into him, undeniable proof of something changing beneath his roof. Yet when he sees Noah tug at her sleeve later, seeking her presence, he realizes his fortress of grief has a crack. The woman he hired to keep the house clean may be stirring something far deeper: life. As days passed, the quiet routines of the Carter mansion began to shift, though not in ways William could have predicted. Aaliyah seemed to make every ordinary task into a stage for something more. Folding laundry, once a mindless chore, became a puppet show where socks transformed into characters with high-pitched voices, and shirts became capes that she draped over Noah or Ethan's shoulders as though they were superheroes. At first the boys only watched, puzzled, their small eyes darting between the fabric and Aaliyah's animated face. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, their lips curled into smiles, their fingers twitching forward to grab the puppets for themselves. What struck William most was how intentional it all seemed. She never forced their participation. She let them approach in their own time, coaxing rather than demanding. "Mr. Sock says he's tired," she would say, sliding the sock across the folded pile. Noah's tiny hand darted out to snatch it, and Aaliyah laughed, clapping once as though he had won a prize. Ethan, not to be left behind, shuffled closer and reached for another piece of cloth. The house, for so long weighed down by silence, filled with these small bursts of laughter that startled William every time he heard them from another room. Sweeping the floor was no longer a task to clear dust, but became a race that made Noah giggle so hard he collapsed onto the rug. Aaliyah would hold the broom like a baton and declare, "Whoever gets to the corner first wins." Ethan, unsteady but determined, would shuffle forward on his short legs, while Noah darted clumsily to keep up, their tiny feet thumping awkwardly against the hardwood. William once stood at the doorway, arms folded, trying to convince himself that this was chaos, unnecessary disorder in a house that thrived on structure. But as he watched his sons, flushed with effort, signing hurried motions at Aaliyah to continue, his stern expression faltered. Their laughter carried a rhythm that tugged at something in him he couldn't name. Emily had once teased him for being too serious, for never allowing life to get messy. Now, seeing his sons collapse in laughter on the floor, clutching at Aaliyah's legs while she pretended to have lost the race, he realized how starved the house had been for messiness, for life itself. Even washing dishes, which William had never bothered to imagine as more than a necessity, became a spectacle. Aaliyah filled the sink with suds, blowing into them until bubbles floated into the air like shimmering balloons. Ethan let out a small sound, half squeak, half attempt at a word, as he pointed upward, his eyes wide with delight. Noah reached for one, clapping his hands together to pop it, then laughed so hard he nearly toppled over. "Catch it! Catch it!" Aaliyah encouraged, her voice alive with energy as she dipped her hand back into the suds to release another stream of bubbles. William, standing in the hallway just beyond their line of sight, pressed a hand against the doorframe, his jaw tense. Pride swelled in him like a tide, pride in his sons for breaking their own silence, pride in Aaliyah for coaxing them into this joy. But alongside that pride came the sharp edge of guilt. Emily should have been the one standing there, creating these moments. It should have been her laughter echoing alongside the boys, her hands covered in soap suds as she filled the kitchen with joy. Instead, it was Aaliyah. The thought was as painful as it was undeniable. Noah and Ethan began to trail after Aaliyah wherever she went, their once hesitant steps now purposeful. She bent to pick up a basket of laundry, and Noah toddled after her, pulling at the edge until she allowed him to carry one small shirt in his arms like a treasure. Ethan followed close behind, murmuring broken syllables that made no sense but carried intent. He mumbled, pointing at the basket, and Aaliyah crouched down immediately. "Yes, Ethan, that's your shirt. Can you say shirt?" He stumbled over the syllables again, his little face scrunched with concentration, until Aaliyah beamed and ruffled his hair. William watched this from the landing above, hidden but unable to tear himself away. His sons were speaking, not clearly, not fluently, but they were trying, because she had given them a reason to. His chest tightened painfully. He wanted to rush down, to kneel beside them and celebrate each attempt, but guilt froze him. He had spent years drowning in work, in grief, convincing himself that silence was inevitable. To join now, when it was her who had opened the door, felt like theft. But Aaliyah didn't treat it as triumph for herself. Each time one of the boys reached for her, she gently redirected their attention back to one another. "Noah, give Ethan the block. Ethan, your turn." She made their bond grow, not just with her, but between them. William noticed the change. The twins, once locked inside themselves even from each other, now began to share. A block passed from one small hand to the other, a giggle answered by another giggle, clumsy words bouncing back and forth. William leaned against the wall, his chest a battlefield. Pride in their progress warred with the haunting whisper that this should not be happening now, not like this. He could hear Emily's voice in his memory, laughing in their old apartment before wealth had hardened him, teasing that their children would be loud and unstoppable. She would never see this, never hear their first clumsy attempts at words. The wound of that truth split open wider every time he saw them laugh. What should have been pure joy carried thorns of pain he couldn't escape. William observed from a distance, conflicted, pride swelling, but guilt whispering that Emily should be the one to see this, not him. The echoes of his son's laughter awakened wounds he thought buried forever. Late one evening, after the boys had gone to bed and the mansion had fallen into its usual hush, Aaliyah lingered in the living room. She was tidying up toys the twins had left scattered across the carpet, smiling to herself at the thought that they had finally grown confident enough to play so messily. As she reached for a ball that had rolled beneath the sideboard, her eyes caught a glimpse of something tucked high on one of the upper shelves. Curious, she climbed on her toes, stretching her arm, and pulled down a silver frame, its edges dulled by dust. She wiped the glass with the hem of her sleeve, and there it was, a photograph of a younger William, smiling in a way she had never seen, his hand entwined with a radiant woman whose eyes sparkled with warmth. Emily. Even though she had never met her, Aaliyah felt she already knew her through the silence that lingered in the mansion and the heaviness in William's gaze. For a long moment, she simply studied the photo, touched by the tenderness captured within it. Quietly, she returned to her task, but before placing the frame back where it had been hidden, she chose a lower shelf, one within sight of the twins. Something told her that they deserved to know this face, to see the love that had existed before them, to understand that their mother was not just an absence, but once a presence, alive and smiling. The next morning, the change was immediate. Noah, wandering curiously through the living room, stopped suddenly before the photo, his head tilted as though he were trying to place the familiar curve of the woman's face. Aaliyah, sitting nearby, watched without interfering, giving him space to process. After a moment, he raised a tentative finger and tapped the glass, then turned to his brother. Ethan toddled closer, squinting at the image, and the two of them stood there in silence, small shoulders brushing. Then Noah, with visible effort, lifted his hands and shaped a clumsy sign. Mama. It was imperfect, hesitant but unmistakable. Aaliyah's chest constricted, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. She crouched beside them, her voice hushed but warm. Yes, sweetheart, that's your mama. Ethan's little fingers fumbled to copy the gesture, though his movements were messy, broken pieces of meaning. Still, the intent was there. Both boys stared at the picture, and Aaliyah reached out gently, resting a hand on each of their backs. She was beautiful, wasn't she? She whispered. The boys didn't answer with words, but their faces softened, as though a piece of them recognized the bond, even without memory. When William entered the room moments later, the sight stopped him cold. His sons stood facing the photograph he had hidden away, their small hands raised in the unsteady shape of a word he had never taught them. For a heartbeat, his lungs refused to draw air. He had buried Emily's memory so deeply, convinced that silence was the only way to protect his children from sorrow. Seeing her face out in the open, and worse, seeing his sons reach for it, felt like a wound reopening. "What are you doing?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, carrying accusation rather than the pain that twisted inside him. Aaliyah turned, her expression calm, though her eyes reflected understanding. "They found her picture," she said softly. They knew before I said a word." William's hands curled into fists at his sides, anger rising not at her, but at the helplessness coursing through him. "They don't understand," he snapped. "They don't need to." But even as he said the words, his gaze betrayed him, drawn inexorably back to his sons. Noah turned at the sound of his father's voice, lifted his hands again, and repeated the sign, "Mama." The word he had feared to speak aloud had taken form in their tiny hands, and it shattered him. He tried to look away, to bury the sight under the armor he had worn for years, but his body betrayed him. His throat burned, his eyes stung, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt tears threaten. He had not cried since the day Emily died. Even at her funeral, he had remained stone-faced, convinced that holding it together was the only way to survive. Now, seeing his children name her, claim her, he could no longer hold back. His knees bent as though the weight of memory forced him down, and he crouched beside them, his hands trembling. "Yes," he whispered, the single word breaking on his tongue. "That's Mama." Noah's face lit up at the confirmation, his hand pressing against the glass, while Ethan leaned against William's shoulder, murmuring syllables that came out slurred but carried meaning. The moment should have broken him, but instead it carried something else, a thread of healing he hadn't thought possible. For the first time, he shared Emily with them, not as a ghost to be hidden, but as part of their story. Aaliyah stayed quiet, watching the scene unfold with a reverence she hadn't planned. She could see the storm raging inside William, the struggle between grief and love, guilt and release. But she also saw something else, a crack in the wall he had built so high. Her choice to bring Emily's memory back into the open had been instinct, but now she realized how vital it had been. The boys needed their mother, even if only in memory, and William needed to see that remembering her didn't mean drowning in sorrow. She spoke softly, carefully. "They'll always know she loved them. That's what matters, Mr. Carter, not how much it hurts you." He didn't answer, but his silence was no longer one of refusal. It was the silence of a man who had just been forced to feel everything he had buried. His hand lingered on Ethan's back, a trembling anchor that told her he was holding on not to grief alone, but to his children as well. When Noah points to the picture and signs clumsily, "Mama," William's heart clenches. He hadn't spoken of Emily in years, fearing to deepen the boy's sorrow. Aaliyah's quiet act brings her memory back into the house, not as a ghost of grief, but as part of the children's lives. For William, it is unbearable and healing all at once. One rainy afternoon, when the mansion felt especially heavy with its usual silence, Aaliyah gathered her courage to reveal something she had kept private for weeks. William had retreated to his office as always, pretending to work, though his thoughts were never far from the twins. When he came down to the living room, intending only to check on them, he froze at the sight of Aaliyah kneeling on the carpet, her notebook open beside her. Scribbles covered the pages, drawings of hands, arrows, repeated words. "What is this?" William asked, his voice caught somewhere between suspicion and confusion. Aaliyah looked up, her expression calm but tinged with nervous determination. "I've been learning something for them," she said softly. She turned toward the twins, who were watching her intently, curious about the strange movements she had been practicing. Slowly, with deliberate care, she lifted her hands and shaped them into a sign. Play. Her lips formed the word as her fingers moved, her expression full of invitation. Noah's eyes widened immediately. Ethan leaned forward, his brows knitting in concentration. They had seen therapists use their hands before, but never with the warmth and patience radiating from Aaliyah now. William stepped further into the room, silent as he watched. "What are you doing?" he asked again, though his voice was lower this time, uncertain. Aaliyah didn't answer him directly. Instead, she shaped another word. Happy. She exaggerated the motion slightly, repeating it once, then placed her hand gently against her chest. "Happy," she said softly. The boys blinked, then tried to mimic the movement. Their small fingers fumbled, their gestures sloppy, but the effort was undeniable. "That's right," Aaliyah encouraged, her voice filled with quiet pride. "Yes, Noah. Yes, Ethan, that's happy." Noah giggled, though the sound was faint, and Ethan's lips moved as though trying to echo the word aloud. William felt something twist inside him. He had paid countless specialists, each of whom had insisted progress would be slow, clinical, measured. Yet here was Aaliyah, with no degree, no training beyond her late-night scribbles, giving his sons a bridge into the world on their own terms. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself this was temporary, but he couldn't ignore the light in their eyes. The twins leaned closer, eager to repeat the signs. Aaliyah introduced another one, her movements slower this time. Love. She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes soft as she looked at them. "Love," she whispered, as though gifting them a secret. Ethan copied first, clumsily pressing his arms against his chest, his face breaking into a small smile when she nodded in approval. Noah hesitated, biting his lip, before he too attempted the gesture. His fingers tangled, his arms awkward, but when he managed it, he let out a tiny laugh. "That's beautiful," Aaliyah said, her voice trembling with emotion. She glanced briefly at William then, and their eyes met. He saw no arrogance, no need for recognition, only a quiet persistence and devotion that unsettled him. She had stayed up night after night, memorizing lines and sketches, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She had given his children something he never had the courage to. The realization hit him like a blow. He had been so consumed with protecting them from disappointment that he had never even tried to learn their language. Shame burned in his chest, hot and suffocating. For the first time, William found himself unable to stay back. He walked forward slowly, as though pulled by an invisible force, and sat down on the edge of the rug across from them. The boys noticed immediately, their small faces lighting up at the sight of their father joining. Noah tugged at his sleeve, babbling unintelligibly but with intent. Ethan reached for William's hand, pulling it closer as if inviting him to participate. William's mouth went dry. He had watched the signs, but his body resisted. His hands, so accustomed to pens, contracts, control, felt clumsy and foreign now. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his throat tightening. Aaliyah's eyes met his again, calm but insistent. "Try," she said softly. Just one word. He swallowed, his chest rising and falling too quickly, but then he lifted his hands. They shook as he formed the shape he had just seen, simple, direct, imperfect. His lips parted, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Papa." The reaction was immediate. Noah gasped, his little hands clapping against his chest before he signed something back, his eyes wide with wonder. Ethan laughed, his arms jerky but enthusiastic as he tried to mirror the sign. Both of them turned toward him, their joy unrestrained, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. William's chest cracked open. He had never considered how powerful a single word could be, especially one carried by hands instead of sound. "Papa," Noah murmured, the syllables broken but audible, and William's heart nearly stopped. Ethan leaned forward, hugging his father's arm, his small body warm and insistent. For the first time in years, William felt not like a spectator in their lives, but like a part of them. The word, trembling as it was, wrapped around him with a force stronger than any wall he had built. The boys' eyes widened, their little hands clumsy but eager to mimic. For the first time, William witnesses them bridging the silence on their own terms. The scene leaves him shaken, ashamed that he never tried hard enough, and in awe of Aaliyah's persistence. For the first time, he signs a trembling word back to his sons, "Papa." Their smiles undo him completely. Hope had begun to take root in William's chest like a cautious flame, but alongside it came a deep unease. Every laugh, every clumsy sign from his sons filled him with awe, but also terror. He wanted to believe they were making progress, real, undeniable progress, but a lifetime of discipline and skepticism held him back. He told himself he needed validation, proof, confirmation that what he was witnessing wasn't just a fleeting miracle. So when Dr. Harold Stein, a respected pediatric neurologist who had followed the boys since birth, scheduled a progress check, William saw it as his chance to finally anchor the fragile hope threatening to consume him. The morning of the visit, he was restless, pacing the living room, rehearsing how he would present Noah and Ethan's new abilities. Aaliyah moved quietly around the house, sensing his anxiety. But when she tried to reassure him with a gentle, "They'll show him who they are," William cut her off with a terse, "We'll see." His jaw was tight, his hands clenched, his entire body braced for either vindication or disappointment. When Dr. Stein arrived, his presence carried the weight of authority William had always respected. The man's calm, clinical demeanor had been a comfort in darker days, though now it felt like a looming judgment. He adjusted his glasses, took notes on a pad, and greeted the twins with polite but detached warmth. William crouched beside Noah and Ethan, his heart hammering, and encouraged them to show what they had learned. "Go on," he whispered, his voice almost pleading. "Show Papa. Show Dr. Stein." At first, Noah lifted his hands, hesitantly shaping a familiar sign, and William's chest surged with pride. But the moment he noticed the doctor's intent gaze, Noah froze, his little fingers faltering. Ethan, sensing the shift in energy, shrank back, burying his face in Aaliyah's side. William's throat tightened. "It's okay," he urged, too forcefully this time. "Do it again, show him." But the boys only clung tighter to Aaliyah, their bodies rigid with discomfort. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dr. Stein cleared his throat softly, jotting something down before speaking. "Mr. Carter," he began with measured patience, "children often mimic gestures in moments of play. It doesn't necessarily indicate meaningful progress." William's head snapped toward him, his pulse roaring in his ears. "They're communicating," he insisted, his voice sharp with desperation. "They're using signs, they're laughing, engaging, things they've never done before." The doctor sighed, his tone careful but firm. "What you're describing is encouraging in a personal sense, but it is anecdotal. We can't equate emotional responses with developmental breakthroughs. I don't want you confusing moments of bonding with measurable improvement. False hope can be damaging, both for you and for them." Each word felt like a hammer striking the fragile structure William had been building. He glanced at his sons, now silent and withdrawn, and the ache in his chest sharpened into humiliation. He had paraded them like exhibits, desperate for approval, and under the scrutiny of science, they had folded back into silence. As Dr. Stein continued his notes, William's emotions ignited into a storm he couldn't contain. Humiliation twisted into anger, and that anger, searching for release, turned toward the one person who had made him believe in hope in the first place. "This is your doing," he snapped suddenly, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Aaliyah, who had been holding Ethan close, looked up in shock. "Mine?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes wide. William stood abruptly, his hands trembling with rage he didn't know how to direct. "You've filled their heads with illusions, parlor tricks. You make them laugh, you get them to mimic you, and suddenly you convince me they're changing. But when it matters, when it counts, they collapse back into silence. Do you realize what you've done? You've given me false hope." The venom in his tone was as much self-loathing as it was accusation, but Aaliyah bore the brunt of it all, her face tightening in hurt. For a long moment, the room was frozen, the twins clinging to her as though sensing the storm. Aaliyah rose slowly, her hands gentle as she reassured the boys, then turned her gaze to William. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, but carried the weight of conviction. "Hope is not an illusion," she said firmly. "It's the only thing that's kept them alive in here." She tapped her chest softly, then gestured toward the twins. "You think reports and charts will raise them? You think statistics will teach them to trust, to laugh, to look you in the eye? No, William. What they need is someone who believes in them. What they need is faith." Her words struck deeper than any medical assessment ever could, but William's pride wouldn't let him yield. His jaw tightened, his silence turning the space between them into a chasm. Aaliyah shook her head slowly, her eyes dimmed by the pain of his rejection. She gathered the boys closer, her body shielding them, and the message was clear. If he would not believe, then she would carry that burden alone. The rest of the day passed in a haze of cold distance. William retreated to his office, drowning himself in papers he couldn't read, his mind replaying the confrontation in a loop of shame and anger. He told himself he had only spoken the truth, that illusions would destroy them all. But deep inside, he knew he had lashed out because the truth terrified him. Aaliyah, for her part, moved through the mansion with a quietness that was heavier than silence itself. She still cared for the boys with patience and love, but her laughter was gone, replaced with measured words and restrained gestures. Noah and Ethan noticed the shift, clinging to her more tightly, their eyes searching for reassurance that the bond they had begun to build had not been shattered completely. By nightfall, the house felt colder than it had in years, the warmth of the past weeks extinguished by anger and pride. Humiliated, William lashes out at Aaliyah, accusing her of giving them illusions. Aaliyah, hurt, reminds him that the boys need faith, not just reports. The confrontation leaves the mansion colder than ever, the fragile trust between them fractured. Days of tension stretched across the mansion like a veil, smothering every fragile spark that had been lit in the weeks before. William and Aaliyah barely exchanged words beyond the necessary, their silences sharp with the memory of their confrontation. He buried himself in his work, lingering in his office even longer than usual, though his thoughts rarely stayed on the documents in front of him. Aaliyah, meanwhile, moved quietly through the halls, her laughter gone, her voice measured, as though every sound she made might fracture the fragile balance even further. The twins felt it most keenly. Noah and Ethan clung to her with more insistence, their little eyes darting to their father whenever he entered the room, sensing the distance they could not name. They still played, but their giggles were softer, rarer, as if afraid to disturb the cold air pressing against them. William hated himself for it, but pride and shame kept him from undoing the damage. Each evening, when the house finally settled into quiet, he replayed his words to Aaliyah, accusations thrown in a moment of humiliation, and wondered how he had allowed himself to wound not only her, but the boys who had trusted her so deeply. It was on a Thursday evening that everything shifted again. Dinner had ended, and Aaliyah was clearing dishes with the twins sitting idly nearby. Noah spotted her bag on the chair, half open, with the small portable speaker peeking out from the top. His eyes lit with recognition. Without hesitation, he slid off his chair, toddled over and pulled it free. Ethan followed, watching his brother curiously, until Noah, with exaggerated care, set the speaker down on the kitchen floor as though he were unveiling a treasure. He pressed the familiar button and music spilled out, clumsy, a little distorted, but enough. Ethan's face broke into a grin, and before Aaliyah could react, both boys began stomping their feet in time with the rhythm, their movements awkward but filled with unmistakable intent. They turned their little heads toward her expectantly, eyes wide, bodies bouncing in an invitation she could not ignore. For a moment she hesitated, her chest tight with the memory of William's accusations, the sting of his words still fresh. But Noah's hands reached for her, his fingers clapping the rhythm, and Ethan echoed him with a high-pitched laugh. The hesitation melted. With a deep breath, Aaliyah let herself step into the circle the boys had created. She bent low, her hands sweeping theatrically as she spun once, then stomped her own feet to match theirs. Their laughter came instantly, bubbling up like a spring that had been waiting for release. Noah squealed with joy, bouncing harder, while Ethan mimicked her exaggerated motions, his tiny arms flailing as he tried to copy her spin. "That's it, baby," she laughed, though her voice trembled with the relief of feeling them alive again. She crouched lower, meeting their eyes, exaggerating every move to feed their energy, and soon they were all three stomping together, the music vibrating through the floor beneath them. The fracture that had divided the household seemed to soften in those moments, as if the sound itself had the power to knit the pieces back together. Aaliyah found herself smiling so hard, her cheeks ached, her heart bursting with gratitude that the boys had chosen her again, even after the days of silence. William had been in his office upstairs, telling himself he would not interfere, that he would let the evening pass like all the others. But then he heard it. Faint laughter, clapping, the unmistakable sound of life spilling back into the house. Against his better judgment, his body moved before his mind could stop him. He descended the stairs slowly, each step tightening the knot in his chest, until he reached the kitchen doorway. The sight before him stole his breath. Noah and Ethan stomped in unison, their eyes shining, while Aaliyah spun in their midst like a beacon of joy. For an instant, William felt the sharp pang of guilt again. But then something extraordinary happened. Both boys turned toward him, their little hands rising in unsteady gestures, signing clumsily but clearly, Dance, Papa." William's heart lurched so violently, he thought his knees might give out. His sons had never invited him in like this, never looked at him with such open expectation. For a moment, panic gripped him. What if he couldn't do it? What if he looked foolish, clumsy, incapable? But their hands kept signing, their eyes locked on him, waiting. Aaliyah turned too, her face soft, silently urging him forward without a word. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of years of grief pressing down, but then he stepped into the room. He raised his arms, awkward and unsure, and swayed in rhythm with them. His movements were far from graceful, but the boys' reaction erased every doubt. They squealed with delight, stomping harder, their laughter echoing through the kitchen until William could no longer hold himself back. He crouched low, mimicking their motions, spinning with them, letting himself fall into the silliness of the moment. For the first time, he wasn't the billionaire or the widower or the man defined by failure. He was simply Papa. His knees weakened, but for the first time he obeys. Not the billionaire, not the broken widower, just a father swaying awkwardly with his sons. The fracture begins to heal in rhythm and laughter. Sleep had become a stranger to William more nights than he cared to count, but this night felt particularly restless. Even after the dance in the kitchen, even after the warmth of laughter and small miraculous signs from his sons, something inside him remained unsettled, unfinished. Hours after the boys had been tucked in and Aaliyah had quietly retired to her room, he wandered into his study, drawn not by obligation, but by something deeper, older. The desk stood in quiet command of the room, untouched for days. He sat heavily, fingertips grazing the surface as memories crowded his chest. Slowly he reached for the drawer he hadn't opened in over 3 years. It resisted slightly, like it too didn't want to remember, but he opened it. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed but never mailed. He knew exactly what it was, had memorized every word, though he hadn't dared to reread it since the day he wrote it. A letter to Emily, scrawled 2 weeks after her death, in a moment of despair, when the silence in the nursery felt unbearable and his sons seemed like strangers who might never know him, love him, or forgive him for surviving when she didn't. He held the letter for a long time before standing. His legs carried him, almost without his permission, down the hall toward Aaliyah's room. He hesitated at her door, letter in hand, his breath shallow with uncertainty. Knocking gently, he waited. Moments later, she opened the door in a simple shirt and sweatpants, her eyes widening at the sight of him. Unshaven, exhausted, holding something like a confession between his fingers. "I wrote this," he said, voice hoarse, "a long time ago, for Emily. I never sent it." She nodded once, stepping aside to let him in. No questions, just space. He handed her the envelope, watching as she sat on the edge of her bed and carefully opened the seal. Her eyes scanned the page slowly, the weight of his words settling into the quiet. She didn't rush. And William, standing nearby, felt naked under her silence. He turned slightly, unable to watch her reaction, but unwilling to leave. He had never shown the letter to anyone. It was the only time he had truly said what he feared most, that he didn't know how to be a father without Emily, that he was terrified he would always fail their children. When she finished reading, Aaliyah's hands trembled as she folded the letter carefully, holding it between her palms like something sacred. She looked up at him, her voice soft but certain. "She would have been proud of you, William." He swallowed hard, not ready to believe it. But she continued, "Not for the empire you've built, not for the money. She would have been proud because you're still here. You stayed. You tried. You're trying." He lowered his head, the emotion in her words crashing into the vulnerable place the letter had opened. She rose and stepped closer, placing the letter gently back in his hand. "You didn't give up on them, or on yourself." His fingers curled around the envelope, clutching it like it might fall apart if he let go. Then she reached out, cupping the side of his face, not romantically but tenderly, with a reverence that startled him. He leaned into it before he could stop himself, closing his eyes. "You were never supposed to be enough alone," she whispered. "No one is." And in that moment he let her see the pain he had kept so expertly buried. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. She sat beside him on the bed, close but not touching, their presence enough to fill the space where words would have only cluttered the truth. He told her about the night he wrote the letter, how Ethan had cried for hours and William had sat outside the nursery door, paralyzed. How Noah wouldn't let him hold him, how he had nearly called Emily's parents to ask them to take the boys, convinced they would be better off without him. He spoke with halting honesty, and Aaliyah listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face. When he paused, afraid of her judgment, she only nodded and murmured, "I'm so sorry you went through that alone." No one had ever said that to him. Not his parents, not his therapist. No one. And for some reason, hearing it from her made something inside him loosen. He didn't cry, not yet, but his breath came shaky, like his body wasn't sure how to handle being understood so deeply without being pitied. In her gaze, he didn't see condemnation or pity. He saw recognition. She had carried grief too in her own ways, and somehow, without ever saying it outright, they met in that shared ache. As he stood to leave, the hour impossibly late now, he looked down at the letter in his hand and then back at her. "Thank you," he said, the words heavier than they seemed. Aaliyah nodded, but didn't say anything more. He reached the doorway and turned back for a moment. Their eyes met, no longer employer and employee, but two people holding on to the same fragile truth, that healing didn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looked like staying. Sometimes like handing someone the worst part of yourself and trusting they wouldn't flinch. William returned to his study and placed the letter back in the drawer, not to hide it, but to preserve it. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was a reminder. He ran his fingers over the wood and sat down, the silence in the room no longer suffocating, but full of something new. One night, unable to sleep, William sits in his study and opens a drawer long locked away. Inside lies an unsent letter he once wrote to Emily, confessing his fear that he would never be enough for the twins. With trembling hands, he shows it to Aaliyah. She reads it silently, tears brimming, and whispers that Emily would be proud of him, not for his fortune, but for every step he still dares to take with the boys. The intimacy of that moment shifts something unspoken between them. Trust deepening into something warmer, more dangerous. The morning carried the delicate touch of spring, a change so subtle that no one in the Carter mansion dared speak of it aloud. It had been a long winter, emotionally, physically, spiritually. The mansion had endured 1,000 days of silence, broken only in pieces these last few weeks, and now something about the air felt different. Aaliyah had planned the garden activity with care, laying out a gentle path of vibrant ribbons across the yard, anchoring them to sticks pushed into the softening soil. Each ribbon was a different color, bright reds, yellows, blues, greens, like a trail of wonder, inviting small feet to follow. She had explained it to the boys in the clearest signs she knew. Walk to the colors, one step, then another. Noah and Ethan looked at her uncertainly, hands twitching as if trying to shape the words back, but they understood enough. It wasn't about rules. It wasn't about therapy. It was play. That morning, play was enough. Ethan was the first to step forward, teetering slightly, arms flailing for balance. Noah followed close behind, more cautious, glancing over his shoulder at Aaliyah, who offered only a quiet smile and a thumbs up. They moved slowly, unsure of their own bodies, but each step felt like a thunderclap to William, who stood back watching with wide eyes. He hadn't been told Aaliyah planned this. She often didn't announce her ideas anymore. Instead, she trusted the boys and trusted herself. And now, as he stood on the porch, one hand gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles whitened, he watched his sons do what he once believed they might never do: move forward, fall down, laugh, and try again. There were no specialists present, no charts, no measuring tape. Just two little boys stumbling along a path of color, giggling when they lost balance, getting up without being told. Their laughter was real. Their voices, though soft and misshapen by silence, were clearer than ever. Ethan squealed a high-pitched "Mama!" looking up at the sky with a grin. And even if he didn't understand what it meant, the sound of it pierced straight through William's chest. Aaliyah didn't interrupt. She merely followed at a distance, ready to catch but never hovering. Occasionally, she signed encouragement. "You're strong. Keep going. I'm proud of you." And the boys responded with half signs, half movements, their fingers slow but learning. William stepped down from the porch, drawn forward almost against his will. His feet moved on instinct, the need to be close overriding the caution that had defined him for too long. As he neared the edge of the path, Noah turned, unexpectedly, suddenly, and looked straight at him. There was no fear in his eyes this time, no shyness or retreat. Instead, he raised both hands and signed as best he could, "Come, Papa." The motion was imperfect, but William understood every bit of it. The breath left his lungs as if he'd been punched, not from pain, but from something greater, something purer. It wasn't a command, it wasn't even a plea. It was an invitation. And William, whose soul had been wrapped in silence longer than his children had been alive, stepped forward. He didn't walk, he ran. Not gracefully, not with the presence of the businessman or the elegance of the man the world assumed he was. He ran like a father desperate to meet his children on the ground where their joy lived. Kneeling, arms open, he gathered them both into his chest. Noah's fingers tangled in his shirt. Ethan leaned his forehead into William's collarbone. He wasn't sure when the sob escaped, but it came raw and uncontained, the kind of cry that had no beginning and no clear end. He didn't try to stop it. Neither boy flinched at the sound. On the contrary, they seemed to lean closer, arms tightening around his shoulders, as if they too understood that this was what love sometimes looked like. Messy, loud, imperfect, human. William kissed their foreheads one after the other, signing the word for love over and over, not because he doubted they knew, but because he needed to say it, needed them to see it and feel it and carry it forward always. Aaliyah stood a few feet back, her hand pressed to her chest. She didn't move, didn't intrude. Her eyes shimmered, but her expression held only stillness, witnessing, not interfering. She understood deeply that this was not her moment to enter, but rather to honor. And yet without her, the moment wouldn't exist. William looked up at her over the boys' heads, their gazes locking in quiet reverence. He didn't say thank you. There were no words for that kind of gratitude, but she saw it. It lived in the way he held his children, in the way his body folded to fit theirs, in the way his pride had finally given way to something far more sacred, belonging. The kind that wasn't built in courtrooms or hospitals or boardrooms, but in laughter and falling and rising again. In ribbons tied to sticks and two boys daring to move through a world they were once afraid of, and in a man who had finally chosen to follow them. As spring approaches, the twins surprise everyone. During a visit to the garden, Aaliyah sets up a trail of colorful ribbons, coaxing them forward step by step. They stumble, laugh, fall, and rise again, their little voices emerging clearer each time. William watches, his heart in his throat, when Noah suddenly turns and signs, "Come, Papa." This time, William doesn't hesitate. He runs, kneels, and gathers both boys into his arms, sobbing freely as Aaliyah looks on. For the first time, father and sons share not only silence, but a promise of steps into the future together. Months had passed, but the change within the Carter mansion felt like a complete rebirth. The house that once stood frozen in grief now pulsed with movement and energy, a rhythm that could be felt in every step taken across its floors. The once meticulously arranged halls were now joyfully chaotic. Tiny socks left behind on staircases, dolls tucked between couch cushions, and plastic trucks lined up like soldiers along the windowsill. Where silence had reigned, now came laughter, imperfect, broken in places, but unmistakably real. The boys no longer clung to shadows or hesitated before entering rooms. Instead, they ran freely, signing quickly and sometimes messily, but always with intent, always with joy. They'd come into their own, and in many ways, so had William. He no longer watched from the periphery. He joined in, sprawled out on the floor with them, hands covered in paint or tangled in shoelaces, pride blooming on his face with every new sign they mastered, every syllable they dared to vocalize. And Aaliyah, no longer just the warm presence who made the house run, was the quiet current beneath it all, guiding without force, shaping without control, becoming something essential. On a particularly warm evening, William decided, without announcement or fanfare, that they would host a small garden gathering. It wasn't a formal party, not the kind his status might dictate, but something more intimate. A few close friends, neighbors who had come to know the boys through their walks or playground visits, and some of the therapists who had seen the miracle unfold. Aaliyah had baked with the boys earlier in the day. Muffins slightly lopsided, cookies with fingerprints pressed into their centers, and they had placed everything proudly on a low table in the yard. Noah wore a hat too big for his head. Ethan had insisted on a cape. The two darted across the grass with fearless energy, stopping every so often to sign excitedly to guests, their gestures still childlike but confident. There were gasps of delight, warm applause, and even a few tears as people witnessed firsthand what could never be captured in a report or video, the transformation of children, not through medicine alone, but through connection. William, ever watchful but no longer afraid, stood near the edge of the lawn, holding 2 glasses of lemonade and scanning the space for Aaliyah. He found her under a tree, quietly rearranging a tray the wind had nudged off balance. He walked to her, paused just long enough for her to look up, and handed her one of the glasses. She accepted it with a grateful nod, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead, her eyes taking in the scene before them. For a moment, neither spoke. There was no need. But then William turned to her, the weight of everything he had never said gathering on his tongue, and said with quiet sincerity, "You brought them back to me. You brought me back to them." The words weren't rehearsed. They had been growing inside him for months, ripening with every bedtime story he now read aloud, with every shared breakfast, with every afternoon spent learning new signs. Aaliyah didn't reply right away. She reached out and touched his arm, not for comfort, but to ground them both in the reality of what they had built together. As if on cue, the boys came barreling toward them, dirt on their knees, icing on their cheeks, arms flailing with excitement. Ethan signed something clumsily that made Aaliyah laugh aloud. Noah tugged at William's shirt, his fingers looping around his father's hand and pulling. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. And in that tug, playful, simple, persistent, they all moved toward the blanket spread beneath the tree. The 4 of them sat close, Aaliyah with one twin nestled against her side, William with the other sprawled across his lap. There was no performance, no moment being crafted for memory. It was just life, beautiful and quiet in its own way, stitched together by ordinary miracles. They passed cookies around, and the boys traded pieces like secrets. William leaned in to whisper something to Aaliyah, and she chuckled, her laughter mixing with the sound of the children's joy. In that small circle under the fading light, the definition of family rewrote itself, not bound by blood alone, but by presence, by the willingness to show up again and again, even in brokenness. William had once believed his mansion stood as a monument to all he'd achieved. Now he understood it was the living that made it sacred, The rooms meant nothing without footsteps. The silence held no power once it was met with a child's giggle or a shared glance that said, "We made it." The wealth he once clung to now seemed irrelevant in the face of what they had built. Not a perfect picture, but a breathing, evolving love. Aaliyah had never demanded space. She had simply filled it when no one else could. And in doing so, she had become something more than he could name. Not a replacement, not a chapter after loss, but an entirely new book. Months later, the Carter mansion is unrecognizable. The halls echo with laughter, toys scatter across the floor, and music never truly stops playing. Aaliyah is no longer just an employee, she is family. On a warm evening, William hosts a small gathering in the garden, where Noah and Ethan run clumsily across the grass, signing words to friends with proud smiles. In a quiet corner, William turns to Aaliyah and says softly, "You brought them back to me. You brought me back to them." The children rush over, tugging their hands together, and in that embrace, the Carter family is reborn, not in wealth or status, but in the simple, extraordinary miracle of love, trust, and soundless laughter. What part of this story touched your heart the most? We'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. If this video moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. It means the world to us. Each story we share here takes days of care, reflection, and love to bring to life, always with you in mind. Your support helps us keep this space alive with more stories that inspire, heal, and connect. Thank you for being here with us, and we hope to see you in the next one.